We began this week, if you remember, Charles, our Moses, reflected on everyone's Moses. Any old bush will do is a line that I remember, as well as good and glory, and the question about God's glory and goodness and how that relates to art. Bayot then took us in a different direction, putting artists first in the marketplace and then second in the church, inviting us to reflect how well they fit as artists of faith in either one. David then led a rather robust conversation about art, aesthetics, and church. And he led that through a series of questions that invited us to reflect both on what we think and what we've experienced. Yesterday, Tim, who I don't see, led us through a conversation about spirituality and being an artist, and spirituality and art, particularly spiritual practices and how art as a practice might relate to spiritual practices. This morning, in my two sessions, what I hope to do is to provide some basic concepts. In German, the term is Baustein, foundational markers, to studying theology and art. This requires a story. So, should let you know, I think in narrative arcs. I don't give short answers, I give stories. Amen. First, Kurt reminds me of a story I should tell. I started out my life as an electrical engineer thinking I was going to work in the music industry doing hardware work in music studios. That's not where I've ended up. I felt called to ministry while doing inner-city youth work at the University of Pittsburgh, and then went off to finish my degree in pre-seminary studies and then seminary. I am ordained. I was born, baptized, confirmed into the one holy covenant and apostolic church. That is the Evangelical Covenant Church. And if you're a member of the Evangelical Covenant Church, just raise your hand. We are taking over, friends. It is a movement. If you want to be part of us, we're going to have a conventicle after this meeting. It is just so good to see my sisters and brothers in the covenant here. What a great serendipitous surprise. The story I'd like to tell, however, is the story of William Brehm. William Brehm was working for the Navy, would later become Undersecretary of State for the United States. While working for the Navy, he lived in Hollywood, California, but he traveled the world. His pastor in Hollywood, at Hollywood Presbyterian Church, was then Lloyd Ogilvie, and the music minister was Fred Bach, two of the great names in that generation in Christianity in the United States. And when Bill would travel from church to church on Sundays, when his travels would take him away from Hollywood, his comment was, if the choir director or worship leader and the pastor knew each other, they didn't like each other because it's obvious they didn't talk that week. There was such synergy between the sermon and the prayers and the music selection in the worship that he experienced at Hollywood Presbyterian Church, and he didn't see that when he went to other churches. It was as if the artist and the pastor could not talk. So Bill, after his career in the U.S. government, went on to become a multimillionaire as a consultant, and was also the chair of the board of Fuller Theological Seminary, a deep person of faith. So he said, I want to create a chair for someone who can help pastors speak with artists. And that was the Brehm chair. They couldn't find anyone to fill the chair. So they began adding money to it and started a Brehm Center. There were colleagues of mine who had expertise in film and visual art and other things. So the Brehm Center started to develop in ways that Bill hadn't imagined. That was fine with him. And then later, they hired the Bach chair for music and the Brehm chair, who was me. But that was actually many years after Bill's initial idea. So where I live is a center that is established to help artists think faithfully about their craft, to help pastors think artfully about their ministry, and help the world think faithfully about the art they experience. And we cover all sorts of different arts when we do this. My expertise is in performing arts. I have some experience in theater. If I had expertise, I would still be doing it. What we decided, however, is we have pastors who want to learn how to use the arts better in ministry, artists who want to become more faithful artists, and then we have people who are just interested in theology and culture, theology and art. And all these people come for different reasons, but we want them all to be in one course at the beginning. So all of those students come into our program through what we call our Touchstone course, where we introduce them the basics of theological reflection on art and worship. So what I'm going to do this day are some of the introductory concepts that we teach in that class. There's much more that can be said, and as you ask questions, I can give more, but that's sort of where all this is coming from. I wanted to give you some perspective on that. And we can talk more about the Brehm Center elsewhere. But I would like to say one of the fruits of the Brehm Center is the fact that we have a doctoral degree, and one of our doctoral students was Tim Bazelin, who spoke yesterday. So he is a graduate of the Brehm Center program in theology and culture. So there you go. So let's begin. I'd like to begin with the idea that Jesus, there is an outline that was on the app, and there are also 3 short essays that I wrote for GIA Quarterly that cover this material. They're very, very short and hopefully easy understood, and they are waiting for you for free on the app, so something to read on the way home from here. Start with the idea that Jesus, in fact, showed a willingness to use the arts in his ministry. The first and most obvious, David mentioned this in his presentation, is the fact that Jesus spoke in parables. Now, hands on buzzers, Bible for 10. What's a parable? Oh, I see it. Bing, bing, bing.
An earthly story with a heavenly.
Okay. What's the opposite of a parable?
Monologue.
Okay. Anyone else? Monologue? Earthly story, the heavenly meaning? Facts? Okay. So in the academy, the term parable is the opposite of the term myth. A myth is a story that may not be historically true, but contains truths about life. So in the United States, one of the myths is, if you work really hard, no matter where you start out in life, you can end up at the top. That's the myth. The parable is, there are lots of people who work very hard all their lives and don't get anywhere near the top. You hear the difference? The myth is, if you get married, you'll live happily ever after. The parable is, half of the people in the United States that get married get divorced. The parable is the inversing of an expectation or a value that people hold, a corrective, if you would. It makes sense that the first should be first. The people who work the hardest, the people that have the most, the people that have the highest status, those people should be first. But those aren't the people Jesus says are the first. Who is it? It's the poor. It's the meek. It's the last who should be first. The kingdom principles are parabolic. They flip things on their heads. So, in Luke chapter 10, Jesus is teaching, and he's just given some instruction to the disciples. And then, just then, verse 25 in chapter 10, just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. Good luck. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And the lawyer said to him, and he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, the lawyer asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus gives a parable as a response. It's a story with an unexpected or an inverted answer. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stopped him, stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed on by the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him. And when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them, and then put him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever you spend." Which of these, do you think, was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The lawyer answered, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." What do you know about Samaritans in the New Testament? Heretics. They were half-breeds. They were the people who tainted the Jewish population by intermarrying. And they had some sort of divergent understandings of the law from mainline Judaism, considered to be bad people. Priests and Levites, what do you know about them? Professional religious people. Okay? What do you know? This is a tricky question. What do you know about blood for a Jew? Unclean. If you are a holy person, professionally holy, board certified holy, and you're walking down the street and you see someone who's bleeding by the side of the road, you want to stay away from someone who's unclean. You'll walk on by. Because it's not worth helping that person if it makes you unclean. Samaritan's already considered unclean. Samaritan sees that person and says, "There's a person that needs help." Not only does he help, he goes over and above in helping. In so doing, he provides a counterpoint to the expected answer. Who is the neighbor? The religious people that know how to love their neighbor, who know how to follow law. They were following the law of staying pure, but not following the law of loving their neighbor, which was the answer to the question, what is the core of the law? It is to love your God with all that you have and to love your neighbor as yourself. So the Samaritan becomes the parabolic, unexpected answer, so much so that the lawyer can't even say Samaritan. It's the one who did good. So offensive was the idea that a Samaritan would be the good example. Parables were artistic ways of getting people to rethink a question and to rethink their values, to correct ways. It's sort of going in the back door rather than just full front assault, no, you're wrong. Parables are artistic traps oftentimes that Jesus lays for people to get them to understand the shortcomings in their own faith. Jesus also showed a little penchant for acting. Jesus, in the end of the Gospel of Luke, had risen from the dead. on the way to Emmaus, he just happens to appear beside two disciples. He's explaining some things as they go, and then Luke records this. As they, that is the two disciples and Jesus, came near the village to which they were going, Jesus walked ahead as if he was going on. Hear that? Jesus was acting as if he had someplace to go. It didn't say Jesus had someplace to go. It says he was acting as if. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us because it's almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went to stay with them. If he would have not acted as if he had someplace to go, would have they been as urgent in keeping him? Who knows? But it's just interesting that Jesus acted in a certain way. Does that mean he was lying or deceptive? No, it just means he was trying to get their attention. Well, if you still want me, you better ask for me. Those are two artistic techniques that Jesus, just two of the artistic techniques that Jesus uses recorded in the Gospels. It shouldn't be a surprise that early Christians used artistic techniques in ministry. Many of them rhetorical, many of them speech acts, but others as well, and we'll talk about that shortly. The point is that Jesus used all he could to communicate efficiently and effectively with people using creativity as a keystone. Now, one of my favorite people, first of all, most of my favorite Christians are dead. One of my favorite Christians is St. Augustine. I think it's just a fascinating story of a life that was turned completely around by the grace of God. And that's a whole other story. But Augustine was also a philosopher. And one of the questions that vexed Augustine more than any other was, how can I have an idea in my head and get that idea in your head without touching you? Think about that. How can we transfer an idea, a thought, an emotion from inside of me and get it inside of you? Augustine believed, according to the philosophy of his day, that there was a time before sin entered when we didn't need our bodies. And we could communicate telepathically. We simply could think a thought and it would go somewhere. But after sin entered the world, we now were body dependent. So now we need our bodies to communicate. The only way I can communicate with you, Augustine would say, are through signs, through words, and through gestures. I can make something. I could make a painting. I can do something like that. I could say something. I could use words that have a grammar that make them more easily understood. I can make gestures. It was this big. It was this tall. But beyond that, that's all we have to communicate, signs, words, and gestures. Think about that for a minute. The only way we communicate with each other is through our bodies. We use our bodies to make sounds, to make gestures, to create things, and we use our bodies to observe, to touch, to sense them, to see them, to hear them. Now, Augustine wrote a treatise on music, and it's not entirely clear, I'm not an Augustine scholar, it's not entirely clear, to me anyway, whether Augustine considers music to be a fourth thing or to be one of the three. I tend to put music in with signs, but it's not a visual sign, it's an audible sign. But there are Augustine scholars who may disagree with me, and you may disagree with me. I'm just saying Augustine's not clear on that. He doesn't talk about music when he writes this passage about how to communicate. Think about the gestures of greeting from culture to culture. I am historically Swedish. I'm going to go visit some of my family in Sweden on my way home from Whistler. Did you hear about the Swede who loved his wife so much he almost told her? Yeah, sure, you betcha. Swedes are not the most embracing people in the world. Southern Europeans, they embrace, they kiss, they make Swedes nervous. Americans are somewhere in between a handshake and a hug, depending where you are in the United States. There's a cultural expectation of how you say hello, and if you don't do it right, people may take offense. Even if you don't intend to offend someone, you may improperly communicate something about your relationship with them, about your joy in meeting them, and the way you respond. So it's not just what you do, but how you do it that has meaning. I'm going to shift thought for just a minute, so hang on to that thought. I want you to imagine that during coffee break, the door behind you gets shut. And we're out there having coffee, and there's things we want to see. We want to hear what Beha has to say. We've got some other things going on, and we can't get in because we hear pounding in here. And there's a picture of a hammer on the door. What might you think that hammer means? There's someone working in here, and they're hammering. It's a sign. A sign is something that has one referent. It means one thing. It means working inside, so stay out. If you took a hammer and hammered something with it, it's a tool. That's what it starts out as. But it can become a sign if you use it to represent something. With me so far? Something can be a tool, but it can also be a sign. What happens if you take a hammer and a sickle and cross them?
Murder.
You've created a symbol, haven't you? It means not one thing, but many things, especially to some of you. So the symbol speaks of a lot of things that not just have meaning, but have emotional content. In each case, we're talking about a hammer. But notice how the hammer functions, first as a tool, second as a sign, and then as a symbol. Architecture. Houses are functional. They're tools. They provide shelter for you. Think of the garbage village. Is that the garbage? Think of the houses that you saw there. They were not aesthetically pleasing. They were almost functional. They were not places that you would choose to live in, but that was the best they had. But you could take a tool like a living dwelling and add beauty to it. Make it symbolic. You could add Corinthian pillars. You could do all sorts of things. So architecture actually becomes a way of communicating not just the physicality of living space, but values, cultural values, maybe your status in society. So things can have layers of purpose or meaning. Art functions in the world of symbol. Art dies when it becomes a sign. And that's what we talked about with commodification. When you take a piece of music and associate it with a thing to sell something, it becomes, this image, this sound means this product. But art opens up possibilities of many interpretations, not just one. It's not a sign. The exclusive use of sign in religion, any religion, leads to fundamentalism, leads to propaganda. That is, this can only mean one thing. And if it doesn't mean this, you're wrong, you're out. Religion has always used symbol. Why? Because God's bigger than any one idea. I'll give you an example, then we'll have a conversation. There's a famous movie that many of you may have seen, The Sound of Music. Anyone not seen The Sound of Music? Sound of Music is takes place in Austria. It's World War II era, and it's about the Von Trapp family trying to make a new life for themselves as Colonel Von Trapp falls in love with his nanny, and the two of them try to create a family in difficult times. Colonel Von Trapp and his bride, Maria, come back from their honeymoon, and you know the scene? What's waiting for them outside the Von Trapp house? It's the Nazi flag. And Colonel Von Trapp is so glad, as a member of the Austrian Navy, that there's a Nazi flag there. He takes it down and he begins to tear it. And then the friendly neighborhood Gestapo shows up. And it's interesting, that scene. If you read the script, it would say Fritz, or whoever it was from the Gestapo, would raise his right hand and say, Heil Hitler. Colonel Von Trapp would do the same thing. Raise his right hand and say, Heil Hitler. But the way it was done was what had the meaning. Heil Hitler is different than Heil Hitler. And if you know that scene, the same gesture meant something different in the way it was done. I'll stop. I've introduced a few different things. That is, we communicate through signs, words, and gestures, and we talk about the physical world of things. Things can be tools, and what they mean is, when they're a tool, that they're a tool. But we can use tools, pictures of tools or the tool themselves, as a sign to point to something else, or in combination with other things, as a symbol. Another example, you take an octagonal sign that's red. Universally, that means stop. It's a sign. If you take that same thing and put a frame around it and put it in an art gallery, it's now a symbol. So Andy Warhol made a lot of money doing things like that. We have, in the Christian faith, the necessity to speak to a transcendent God who is bigger than any one sign. Art has always been used, whether it's rhetorical arts, visual arts, musical arts, to speak of a God that is bigger than any one vocabulary.